Let's all raise a glass to the most expensive, useless old woman in this room," my son's bride said into the microphone, and within seconds, the laughter of 260 wedding guests filled the ballroom. I still remember the sound, not because it was loud, but because it was unexpected. A few moments earlier, I had been sitting at table 7, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blue dress and trying not to cry as I watched my son begin a new chapter of his life. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I was 68 years old that evening, and I believed I was attending one of the happiest days of my life. The reception was being held at a luxury hotel outside Dallas. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the room. Fresh white roses decorated every table. A jazz trio played softly near the dance floor. Everything looked beautiful. Everything looked perfect. Sabrina Collins, the bride, stood confidently in the center of the room with a champagne flute in her hand. Her designer gown shimmered under the lights as she smiled at the guests. "Of course," she continued, "we couldn't have had this wedding without Margaret. She paid for so much of it. Though honestly, I'm still trying to figure out what else she actually does." More laughter followed. Some people covered their mouths. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. I noticed one elderly couple near the back stop, smiling all together. My fingers tightened around my water glass. Across the room, my son Ethan laughed softly and looked down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't even look at me. That hurt far more than Sabrina's words. For a moment, the ballroom seemed strangely quiet to me despite all the noise. I could hear the clinking of silverware, the distant hum of the air conditioning, the rustle of fabric as guests shifted in their seats. I felt as though I were watching everything through a window. Sabrina continued her speech, moving on to stories about their relationship, but I barely heard a word. My mind kept returning to that phrase. Useless old woman. It was such a small sentence, yet it carried years of disrespect inside it. Years of comments disguised as jokes. Years of being tolerated rather than appreciated. I lifted my eyes toward the head table. Ethan was smiling again. Sabrina leaned toward him, and they looked every bit like the happy newlyweds everyone had come to celebrate. I smiled too, not because I found any of it amusing, not because I wasn't hurt. I smiled because something inside me became very clear at that moment. This toast had not been spontaneous. It had not been harmless. It had not been a joke. It was a message, and for the first time, I finally understood exactly where I stood in their lives. What nobody in that ballroom knew was that my late husband Harold had left behind one final wedding gift, a gift that neither Ethan nor Sabrina knew existed. And before this story was over, that gift would change everything. I stayed until the end of the reception. That surprised even me. A younger version of myself might have left early, claiming a headache or exhaustion, but age teaches you something valuable. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is stay still and watch. I sat through the cake cutting, the photographs, the dancing, and the endless stream of congratulations. People came to my table throughout the evening. Some offered polite smiles. Others avoided eye contact completely. A few seemed embarrassed on my behalf. One woman I barely knew touched my shoulder and quietly said, "You handled yourself with grace." I thanked her and smiled. Grace was easier than explaining how disappointed I felt. Around 10 o'clock, the ballroom began to empty. Guests gathered purses and jackets. The band packed away their instruments. Hotel staff quietly cleared dishes from the tables. Ethan finally approached me. He looked tired but happy, the way people often look after a wedding day. "Did you have a good time, Mom?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, not because it was cruel, but because it sounded sincere. For a moment, I studied his face. He truly did not seem to understand what had happened. Or perhaps he had convinced himself that none of it mattered. "It was a memorable evening," I replied. He laughed lightly. Sabrina was nervous during the toast. She was just trying to be funny. I nodded. Of course. He seemed relieved by my answer. Then he hugged me, thanked me again for everything I had done for the wedding, and hurried away to join his new wife. I watched them cross the room together. Sabrina never looked back. The drive home took nearly 40 minutes. Dallas traffic had finally thinned, and the roads were quiet. I turned off the radio and listened only to the sound of the engine. The silence felt comforting after hours of forced celebration. When I reached my house, I sat in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. The porch light illuminated the front yard Harold and I had cared for together for more than 20 years. The rose bushes along the walkway were blooming. He had planted them himself. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice telling me not to let difficult people steal my peace. Inside, the house felt exactly as it always did. Calm, familiar, honest. I kicked off my shoes, hung my dress carefully in the closet, and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. Midnight had come and gone by the time I finally settled into the living room. My eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf. Harold was smiling in it. The picture had been taken during our 40th wedding anniversary trip to Colorado. He looked strong and confident, as though nothing in the world could surprise him. A soft laugh escaped me. Harold would not have been surprised by Sabrina. In truth, he had seen things long before I did. During the final year of his life, there had been several conversations I did not fully understand at the time. Small remarks, careful questions, warnings disguised as observations. Back then I assumed he was simply being protective. Now I was beginning to wonder if he had been preparing me for something. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of my phone vibrating on the coffee table. It was nearly 1 in the morning. Few people called at that hour. I picked up the device and looked at the screen. The caller identification displayed a name I had not seen in months. Benjamin Carter, Harold's attorney. I stared at the phone for a moment before answering. Margaret, he said calmly after I picked up. I apologize for calling so late. But after what I witnessed tonight, I believe it is time we had a conversation about something Harold instructed me to keep private. Benjamin's voice was calm, measured, and carried a weight of authority as he spoke across the phone line. Margaret, Harold left instructions for a contingency plan should anything like tonight occur, he said. I listened closely, gripping the edge of the sofa, the warmth from my tea long gone. The room around me was quiet except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. He anticipated conflicts and moments where his estate could be misrepresented or manipulated. Benjamin continued. Tonight confirmed that we should proceed. I nodded silently, feeling the first hint of control returning to my chest. Benjamin explained that Harold had set aside a portion of funds and documents in a safe deposit box under a separate account, accessible only to me with his personal authorization. These instructions were written years before, anticipating situations where Ethan or Sabrina might act hastily or arrogantly with family assets. He described the location in the downtown Dallas bank, detailing the requirements for access and the sequence for notifying legal witnesses. Each step seemed designed not only to protect the estate, but also to reveal character. I realized Harold had anticipated the tension between parties and had a plan that preserved dignity while ensuring fairness. Benjamin emphasized discretion, that the purpose was not to humiliate anyone, but to maintain integrity and ensure that assets would be allocated according to Harold's wishes rather than impulsive decisions made by the heat of emotion. As I absorbed every detail, I allowed myself to imagine walking into the bank the following morning, alone, empowered by the preparation my husband had orchestrated. I could picture the documents, the crisp paper, and Harold's careful handwriting, a reminder that he had always thought several moves ahead. I thought about Sabrina and her carefully practiced smile, the way she had assumed confidence during the toast, and yet she had no idea of the safeguards put in place years ago. Ethan, caught between his mother and wife, had no inkling of the plan designed to uphold the truth. A quiet resolve formed in me. I would follow each instruction, step by step, calm and deliberate. There would be no public confrontation, no rash accusations, only the structured unfolding of Harold's foresight. I set down the phone and exhaled slowly, letting the tension of the evening seep from my shoulders. For the first time since the wedding toast, I felt a sense of order returning. I walked to the window and looked out at the still night, the streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement from an earlier rain. My reflection in the glass showed a woman steady, composed, not at all the useless person Sabrina had mocked. I imagined the following days, quiet yet purposeful, moving with intention through Harold's instructions, navigating the subtle and often unseen battles that had been placed before me. Tonight had been a test, and I had observed, I had endured, and I had listened. The next steps were mine to execute with care and certainty, guided by the wisdom and planning of the man I had loved for more than 40 years. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Old habits stay with you after a lifetime of responsibility. The house was quiet, and for a few moments I lay still, listening to the familiar sounds around me. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant chirping of birds outside my bedroom window, the soft creak of settling wood. For years, mornings had begun with Harold reading the newspaper at the kitchen table while I prepared coffee. Even now, more than a year after losing him, I sometimes expected to hear his footsteps in the hallway. I dressed carefully and chose a simple cream-colored blouse with navy slacks. There was no reason to impress anyone. Today was about clarity, not appearances. By 8:30, I was driving toward downtown Dallas. The city was already awake. Office workers hurried along sidewalks carrying briefcases and paper cups. Traffic moved steadily beneath a bright Texas sky. During the drive, I found myself thinking about Ethan as a little boy. He had been kind once. Thoughtful. The sort of child who brought home injured birds and cried during sad movies. I remembered helping him build a model rocket for a school science fair when he was 11. We stayed up until midnight painting tiny details on the fins. When he won second place, he hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe. Somewhere along the way, life had changed him. Or perhaps he had simply stopped paying attention to the people who loved him most. The bank stood 12 stories tall, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sunlight. I parked nearby and entered the lobby. Everything smelled faintly of polished marble and fresh coffee. Benjamin was already waiting for me. He stood near the elevators holding a leather portfolio beneath one arm. His expression was professional, but there was kindness in his eyes. "Good morning, Margaret," he said. "Are you ready?" I nodded. We rode the elevator in silence. Several floors below street level, a bank manager escorted us into a secure vault area. Thick steel doors separated rows of private boxes. The manager verified identification and completed several forms before finally retrieving a long rectangular container. He placed it on a private table and left us alone. For a moment, neither Benjamin nor I moved. My hands rested lightly on the edge of the box. It felt strangely significant, as though Harold himself were sitting across from me waiting to see my reaction. "Take your time," Benjamin said softly. I opened the container. Inside were several sealed envelopes, a binder, and a handwritten letter resting neatly on top. The sight of Harold's handwriting immediately tightened my throat. He had always written in careful block letters, every word precise and deliberate. I picked up the letter and slowly unfolded it. "Dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then circumstances have unfolded exactly as I feared they might." I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. Practical, direct, never dramatic. As I continued reading, Harold explained that over the final years of his life, he had observed patterns that concerned him. Not crimes, not scandals, something far simpler. Entitlement. He wrote about conversations, assumptions, expectations, and attitudes. He never mentioned Sabrina directly, but I knew precisely who he meant. He also described how easily gratitude can disappear when people begin viewing generosity as an obligation rather than a gift. By the time I reached the final page, tears blurred my vision. Not from sadness, from recognition. Harold had seen everything long before I had. And buried inside the binder beneath that letter was evidence that he had spent years preparing for the moment when the truth would finally need to speak for itself. Inside the binder, each page was meticulously organized. Receipts, photographs, and notes documented contributions I had made over the years, some for weddings, some for family gatherings, some simply for helping with small projects around the house. It was astonishing to see everything laid out so clearly. Harold had anticipated more than just the ordinary financial arrangements. He had also documented attitudes, conversations, and subtle dynamics within the family. Every carefully recorded observation painted a picture that was invisible to those caught up in the day-to-day. I turned the pages slowly, each one reinforcing a sense of clarity that had eluded me before. There were letters from friends who had witnessed the small ways Sabrina manipulated situations to her advantage. Notes about Ethan's tendencies to prioritize convenience over familial obligation, and reminders of my own acts of kindness that were often overlooked or taken for granted. The meticulousness of it all was unmistakable. Every note, every receipt, every letter reinforced the same truth. Harold had not left me unprepared. He had been thinking decades ahead. I sat back in my chair and absorbed it all, feeling a calm resolve settle over me. The room, quiet except for the subtle ticking of the clock, felt like a sanctuary in that moment. I could hear my own breathing and the soft rustle of papers as I adjusted the binder in my lap. Benjamin watched quietly, letting me take in the significance without interruption. He did not need to speak. The weight of Harold's foresight was enough. I traced my finger along one of the letters, noting the meticulous penmanship and careful phrasing, feeling the warmth of his thoughtfulness. It was not about revenge. It was about fairness, clarity, and the affirmation that truth could be documented and revealed without raising a voice. The logic was simple, yet profound. If the family ever acted with disregard or attempted to rewrite history, the evidence was already in place, framed in such a way that it would stand unquestioned. For hours I remained there, absorbing every detail, forming a quiet strategy in my mind. The complexity of Harold's preparation amazed me. He had included contingencies for hesitation, misinterpretation, and even the potential for surprise confrontations. Everything had been anticipated. Finally, I closed the binder and placed the letter carefully on top. I took a deep breath, feeling the first sense of empowerment that I had experienced since the wedding. No longer merely a passive observer of events, I felt a renewed sense of agency. I understood the importance of patience, of measured steps, of waiting for the moment when clarity could be demonstrated rather than argued. Benjamin nodded approvingly, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I smiled faintly, feeling the calm weight of preparation settle firmly around me like a shield. The plan was clear. The evidence was undeniable. I would proceed deliberately, ensuring that truth and fairness were not only preserved but revealed at the proper time, and I would do so with composure, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that Harold had never left me without the means to protect what was rightfully mine. Inside the binder, each page was meticulously organized. Receipts, photographs, and notes documented contributions I had made over the years, some for weddings, some for family gatherings, some simply for helping with small projects around the house. It was astonishing to see everything laid out so clearly. Harold had anticipated more than just the ordinary financial arrangements. He had also documented attitudes, conversations, and subtle dynamics within the family. Every carefully recorded observation painted a picture that was invisible to those caught up in the day-to-day. I turned the pages slowly, each one reinforcing a sense of clarity that had eluded me before. There were letters from friends who had witnessed the small ways Sabrina manipulated situations to her advantage, notes about Ethan's tendencies to prioritize convenience over familial obligation, and reminders of my own acts of kindness that were often overlooked or taken for granted. The meticulousness of it all was unmistakable. Every note, every receipt, every letter reinforced the same truth. Harold had not left me unprepared. He had been thinking decades ahead. I sat back in my chair and absorbed it all, feeling a calm resolve settle over me. The room, quiet except for the subtle ticking of the clock, felt like a sanctuary in that moment. I could hear my own breathing and the soft rustle of papers as I adjusted the binder in my lap. Benjamin watched quietly, letting me take in the significance without interruption. He did not need to speak. The weight of Harold's foresight was enough. I traced my finger along one of the letters, noting the meticulous penmanship and careful phrasing, feeling the warmth of his thoughtfulness. It was not about revenge. It was about fairness, clarity, and the affirmation that truth could be documented and revealed without raising a voice. The logic was simple, yet profound. If the family ever acted with disregard or attempted to rewrite history, the evidence was already in place, framed in such a way that it would stand unquestioned. For hours I remained there, absorbing every detail, forming a quiet strategy in my mind. The complexity of Harold's preparation amazed me. He had included contingencies for hesitation, misinterpretation, and even the potential for surprise confrontations. Everything had been anticipated. Finally, I closed the binder and placed the letter carefully on top. I took a deep breath, feeling the first sense of empowerment that I had experienced since the wedding. No longer merely a passive observer of events, I felt a renewed sense of agency. I understood the importance of patience, of measured steps, of waiting for the moment when clarity could be demonstrated rather than argued. Benjamin nodded approvingly, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I smiled faintly, feeling the calm weight of preparation settle firmly around me like a shield. The plan was clear. The evidence was undeniable. I would proceed deliberately, ensuring that truth and fairness were not only preserved but revealed at the proper time, and I would do so with composure, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that Harold had never left me without the means to protect what was rightfully mine. The morning after the wedding felt nothing like the chaos of the night before. There were no raised voices, no forced smiles, no champagne glasses lifted in mockery. Instead, there was silence. A heavy, deliberate silence that filled every corner of my house as I stood by the kitchen window and watched the sunlight slowly move across the driveway. I had not slept much, but I did not feel tired in the way I once would have. Something inside me had shifted. The grief I carried for so long after Harold's passing still existed, but now it sat beside something else. Clarity, control, purpose. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the same table where I had once hosted family dinners that no one seemed to appreciate anymore. My phone rang before I had even taken a sip. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I answered without hesitation. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed. He asked me how I was feeling after the wedding, as if the humiliation I had experienced could be categorized as a simple emotional inconvenience. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I was fine. My voice was steady, almost unfamiliar to myself. There was a pause on the line, as if he had expected something else. Anger, perhaps. Tears. Anything that would allow him to return to normal. But I gave him none of it. Instead, I told him I had things to take care of that day. He did not ask what I meant. He simply said he would call later, and then the line went silent. A few minutes after that, another message arrived. This time it was from Sabrina. Not a call. A short text. Just a single line asking if I was okay after everything. The phrasing alone told me everything I needed to know. It was not concern. It was monitoring. A check to see if the damage they inflicted had worked as intended. I did not reply. I placed the phone face down on the table and looked out the window again. For the first time, I noticed how different my home felt when I was not reacting to anyone else's expectations. There was space in it. Real space. Not emptiness, but possibility. Later that morning, my phone vibrated again. This time it was Benjamin. His message was short and precise. Today is the day. 11 o'clock. My office. I read it twice before setting the phone down. There was no need for clarification. No need for hesitation. The structure of what Harold had prepared was already in motion. I walked slowly toward the living room and stood in front of the bookshelf where the binder still rested. I did not open it. I did not need to. Its presence alone was enough. It was no longer just a collection of documents. It was direction, evidence, time waiting to be revealed. I thought about the wedding again, about the laughter, about the words that had been spoken so casually in front of so many people. And I thought about how quickly people forget that silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is preparation. I picked up my coat and walked toward the front door. As I stepped outside, the air felt different than it had the night before. Lighter, sharper. I locked the door behind me and did not look back. Whatever came next would not be a reaction. It would be a decision. And for the first time in a long time, it would be mine. The day of the family gathering arrived with a stillness that felt heavier than any argument or raised voice could have created. I arrived at the venue quietly, carrying only the binder and a calm determination that I had carefully nurtured over the past weeks. The air was warm, the sun slanting through the windows with a soft, golden light. But inside me, the tension was palpable, not because I feared confrontation, but because I knew that the moment I had prepared for had finally come. Ethan and Sabrina were already there, arranging the chairs and speaking to the caterers with casual ease, oblivious to the shift in power that had quietly taken place behind the scenes. I stepped into the room and felt a slight hesitation ripple through the atmosphere, though no one said a word. Benjamin was at my side, holding additional documents and standing with a quiet confidence that mirrored my own. I opened the binder in front of me, laying out the evidence with deliberate care: letters, photographs, financial statements, all compiled in meticulous order to show the deliberate pattern of behavior that had been ignored for too long. Ethan's eyes flicked to the table, then quickly away, as though he was beginning to sense that something was off, but he could not yet grasp the full weight of what he was about to witness. Sabrina's smile faltered slightly, the first crack in the mask she had so confidently worn. She looked around, noticing how silent everyone had become. I began speaking slowly, my voice measured, each word deliberate, recounting events, contributions, and evidence without accusation, merely stating the facts and the observations Harold had meticulously documented. The room absorbed each statement with a growing realization that the narrative they had assumed they controlled was not only incomplete, but deeply skewed in favor of truth and fairness. As I continued, the shift was unmistakable. Faces paled, gestures hesitated, and whispers of disbelief rippled through the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead or demand. I simply presented the facts, and the weight of truth spoke louder than any argument could. Benjamin supported each point with the relevant documents, unfolding the layers of what had been hidden, showing not only financial accountability, but also the intentional manipulations that had been quietly perpetrated. Sabrina's attempts to interject fell flat, her words lost amid the mounting clarity of evidence. Ethan looked on, his expression one of shock and dawning comprehension, the first real understanding that his assumptions had been misguided. By the time I closed the binder, a profound silence settled over the room. It was complete, unbroken, and heavy with the realization of consequences long prepared but only now revealed. I met Ethan's eyes and held his gaze without anger or reproach, simply letting the weight of the facts convey their own judgment. Sabrina's composure had entirely vanished, replaced by a tense awareness that the narrative she had carefully constructed for years was finally dismantled. And as I stood there, calm, composed, and fully in control, I realized that no loud confrontation, no angry outburst, was needed to reclaim my dignity. The evidence alone had shifted the balance, and the family could see it, each member processing the undeniable truth. I gathered the binder, smiled softly, and said only one sentence: "I have known all along." The room held its collective breath, the power of silence, control, and meticulous preparation, leaving everyone stunned and aware that the quietest person in the room was, in fact, the strongest.